Good evening and welcome everyone to today's edition of the Climate Emergency Film Club. Thanks for joining us tonight. We're really excited for today's program. The last two sessions have been fantastic. We have a great panel for you tonight to talk about a really great segment of the film. My name is Kevin Richardson. I'm with Halt the Harm. We're helping to put on this event and I'll be running technical tonight. So if you have any technical issues, please reach out to me in the chat and I'll help you with them. While everyone gets situated and gets a glass of water or a cup of tea, I'm going to talk about a couple of things related to Halt the Harm before I pass it off to Physicians for Social Responsibility, Pennsylvania. So, like I said, my name is Kevin Richardson. I'm with Halt the Harm Network. We're a network of grassroots leaders and activists across the country, and we have both a directory and an awesome message forum where you can post updates and see updates from other leaders from across the country. And I encourage everyone to check those out. We also have a number of awesome services to help people in their activism across the country, including a help center that has all sorts of resources about fracking, our website, halttheharm.net, and the network I mentioned before. In addition, as a kind of advance warning, there'll be a feedback survey after tonight's call, which you guys can provide feedback on what you thought of the event. And we also, if you're interested in putting on events with us, you can email me. I'll put my email in the chat with all these links. I also will be putting the recording of this on the Halt the Harm Network forum, and I'll put a link to where that's going to go in a few moments as well. But again, we're really excited for tonight's presentation. It's going to be a great panel discussion. I've really enjoyed all of these discussions so far and the film as well. And I think it's a really informative and great piece to think about climate change and how to fight it. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and pass it over to PSRPA, Tanya.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Tanya Verkaitis, the Executive Director at PSR Pennsylvania. Welcome and thank you for joining us for our third installment of Climate Emergency Film Club, Atmosphere. As you know, we had two previous viewings. If you weren't able to see them, we do have them on our website at psrpa.org. We have other events that are coming up in the future, such as steel, gas, and petrochemical tours in Pittsburgh next week. I'll share information about those things as well in the chat as we're doing this program. But for now, I'm happy to welcome two special guests as part of our panel for this particular episode of Climate Emergency Film Club. The first is Dr. Deepti Singh. She is an assistant professor in the School of Environment at Washington State University. Her research aims to improve the understanding of the many ways in which climate change is affecting our society to inform adaptation efforts and disaster preparedness. Towards this, her work is centered on advancing our understanding of the physical drivers of climate hazards, such as heat waves, droughts, extreme precipitation, and wildfires, and how such hazards are affected by natural climate variability and human-caused climate change. Also with us is Jennifer Francis, the acting deputy director and a senior scientist at the Woodwell Climate Research Center in Falmouth, Massachusetts. Previously, she spent 24 years as a research professor in the Department of Marine and Coastal Sciences at Rutgers University, where she studied the Arctic climate system and how rapid Arctic change is affecting areas beyond the Arctic, particularly extreme weather in the Northern Hemisphere. Jennifer earned a BS in meteorology from San Jose State University in 1988 and a PhD in atmospheric sciences from the University of Washington in 1994. She and her husband circumnavigated the globe by sail during the early 1980s. That's a story I'd like to hear, including the Arctic, which is where her interest in the region began. Our moderator for this evening is Dr. Daniel Wolk, a family physician and geriatrician who is on the faculty at the Bryn Mawr Family Medicine Residency Program. Dr. Wolk joined PSRPA in 1981 while an intern to help stop the nuclear arms race and is currently on the advisory council. His environmental activism dates back to reading Rachel Carson's The Sea Around Us at age 11 and continues today as a speaker and advocacy educator for PSRPA with the Citizens Climate Lobby and his township's sustainability working group. I thank you all for being here. Before I hand it over to Dr. Wolk, just a few housekeeping notes. Please put questions that you may have into the chat and we will get to as many of them as possible at the end of the discussion. Also, feel free to use the chat to share comments or resources that pertain to this particular discussion. Again, thank you for joining us. And with that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Wolk.
Thank you very much, Tanya. So, the feedback loops we've been learning about through these short films, including the latest one, Atmosphere, are examples of how wonderfully complex our globe system is and how much more there is to study. But also, it creates another dimension of to our discussions of climate change and how we can get things under control to stop CO2 levels from rising and sending us into conditions similar to what they were 800,000 years ago. So with that, I'd like to invite our two panelists to give a brief introduction about what they're thinking about these atmospheric feedback loops and how they impact us in terms of our public health. Who would like to go first?
Well, I can get us started if you like. Hey, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in, and thank you for having me part of this panel. It's a really important discussion to be having, as we have all watched the headlines this summer, seen just unprecedented heat waves in numerous locations around, especially the Northern Hemisphere, whether it's China and Europe, the western part of the United States. Just all sorts of areas have been suffering through some pretty amazing heat. We've also seen incredible examples of summertime flooding in the last few months, just amazing flip-flop sometimes from hot, dry conditions to flash flooding. We've seen this happening again in Germany, in parts of Illinois and Kentucky, various places again around the Northern Hemisphere especially. And we know that these kinds of changes are directly connected with the climate crisis. We know that as we continue to dump greenhouse gases into the atmosphere that trap heat down by the surface, we are shifting the temperature distribution around the globe towards the hot end. So as we shift that average temperature towards the warmer temperatures, then we have to expect to see more of these kinds of heat waves occurring. It's completely, it makes a lot of sense, you know, we're warming the globe, and so we're also going to see heat waves like this. The moisture story is also really interesting, I think, and doesn't get as much attention as it should, because as we warm the atmosphere and the ocean, we're causing more evaporation to occur from the ocean and from the land into the atmosphere. And this means that there's now more water vapor in the atmosphere, the gaseous form of water. And this has numerous impacts on us. So first of all, that extra water vapor is a greenhouse gas as well. Water vapor traps heat just like carbon dioxide does. And so this is one of the feedback loops that was discussed in the film, that as we add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, we trap more heat, more evaporation, more water vapor, which traps more heat and gets this vicious cycle going. So it's making the whole global warming problem even worse, and quite a bit worse, as a matter of fact. That moisture also provides fuel for storms. So when that moisture that takes heat from the ocean, when it evaporates, puts it in the atmosphere. And then when it condenses into liquid again, into a cloud, that heat is released into the atmosphere. And that is really the fuel that drives storms. So as we increase that water vapor, we're seeing stronger storms. We've have documentation of hurricanes, for example, intensifying more rapidly. We see an increase in the frequency of especially the very intense categories of hurricanes. And again, this is directly linked to this climate crisis that we're experiencing before our very eyes. And finally, that extra water vapor also has a very important health consequence, because as especially tropical areas that are already hot and already humid, when we add that extra humidity to the atmosphere, we increase what's called the wet bulb temperature. That wet bulb temperature is really a measure of the heat and moisture that's in the atmosphere. And when it gets to a certain level, the human body just can't cool itself anymore through the natural sweating process. And so there is a threshold where if we exceed a certain level of this wet bulb temperature, people just can't survive, because they can't get rid of that heat that built up during the day. So there's a lot of things that I think the water vapor story is contributing to that really doesn't get as much discussion and awareness as it should. So I'll pass it over to Deepti now.
Oh, thanks, Jennifer. That was a really nice summary of the last few months that we've had here and how these feedbacks have been so relevant for them. Yeah, and I think most recently I've been thinking about this water vapor feedback in the context of the flooding that's happening in Pakistan, which I think, we really should be talking about and thinking about more. The country has the pictures of flooding in that area have not changed a whole lot in the last 3 weeks. A third of the country is underwater right now. And that's, again, something that is a direct consequence of more moisture being present in the atmosphere. And so when these rainfall events and monsoons and meteorological processes that bring rainfall happen, they tend to rain out more. And on the flip side of that, we've seen that have an effect on droughts here in many parts of the U.S. And I live in the Northwest, and we've seen some record-breaking droughts that have contributed to wildfires in the region, and this flip-flop between dry, hot conditions in the summer, which have resulted in fires. Combined with heavy precipitation when it does rain, which then creates a cascade of disasters when you have these compounding events happening. And then one of the other feedbacks that was talked about is how changes in the Arctic are affecting our weather patterns, and these weather patterns are we've seen certain weather patterns cause simultaneous heat waves or simultaneous extreme events and disasters in multiple regions. And again, that's something that is important to think about, because we live in a world where that's interconnected, and when disasters happen in certain regions, they can cascade through those interconnected systems. And in particular, thinking about food, for example, when we have heat wave occurring in multiple bread baskets, that can affect food availability, and it can affect global food prices and affect global food security. And that's something I think about a lot. And you mentioned Daniel talking about the health impacts of this, and this is these extreme events and this changing climate is affecting every aspect of our health, from the quality of the air that we breathe to the quality and quantity of food that's available, to the quality and quantity of water that we need. In particular, the health impacts of the smoke associated with fires here in the Western U.S. It's we don't even know the composition of that smoke anymore, but we know that there are enough harmful air pollutants in there that have negative impacts on the population here in the Western U.S. And that smoke gets carried by these weather patterns across and affects a much larger population. and it's, it's affecting the smoke, the level of air quality here, as well as the quality of water that we're seeing. And there's states in the Western US that are experiencing shortage of water, pretty severe shortages of water because of changes that are happening in the climate system. So yeah, I think maybe I'll just stop there.
One thing I'm curious about, and Jennifer, maybe you could speak to this, is if you could comment on the severe weather event that occurred in Texas last year, which was a severe cold snap, which was, I assume, due to instability in the jet stream, allowing a wave of cold air to essentially hit Texas and knock out all of their electric power because they weren't prepared for such cold temperatures. And that has obvious impacts on public health and our security in terms of things that we take for granted, like having the lights go on when we flip the switch and being able to turn on the air conditioner or heat. Can you comment on that?
Sure. Yeah, so you're talking about the extreme event that happened in February of 2021, so like a year and a half ago now, when a very long-lived, severe, and huge cold spell descended upon the middle of North America. And that cold air extended all the way down to the border with Mexico. At part of that cold spell, Dallas hit low temperatures around -2 degrees Fahrenheit, which at the time was colder than large areas in Alaska and also Greenland. So yeah, it was a very, very unusual cold spell. And it, as you say, Daniel, it did a lot of damage because that cold air went to places where people just aren't used to dealing with it. You know, it gets that cold in Minnesota all the time and they are totally equipped to dealing with it. But when you get into southern Texas and Oklahoma and Louisiana and places where it's generally pretty mild, their infrastructure just isn't designed to deal with it. But it's not the first time a cold spell like that has happened. There was one back in 2010 as well that was almost as bad. And the utility managers didn't seem to learn their lesson back then, thinking perhaps that this was never going to happen again because of global warming. Well, what we're learning through our research is that, in fact, these kinds of events may actually be more likely in the future. And the reason is because, as Deepti mentioned, there's a connection between what's happening in the Arctic and the extreme weather events that we're experiencing in winter and summer. And what we think is going on is that, first of all, we know that the Arctic is warming much faster than anywhere else on the planet. Recent estimates are like 4 times faster than the globe as a whole. And so what this does is it's reducing the north-south temperature difference. You know, obviously it's cold up there, it's warmer down where most of us live. And that temperature difference between those two regions is really the fuel that drives what we call the jet stream. And the jet stream is this fast-moving river of wind up at altitudes where the jets fly. And so as we weaken that north-south temperature difference, because the Arctic's is warming so fast, then we're also weakening those west to east winds of the jet stream. And when the jet stream is weaker, it tends to take bigger swings to the north and south, or get into a wavy pattern more often. And those big waves in the jet stream, so you can imagine looking at a map of North America and seeing the jet stream, go way far north and then dip way down south. And the jet stream is really a boundary between the cold air to the north and the warmer air to the south. So when we see it take one of these big southward dips, that allows that cold air from the Arctic to penetrate much farther south than normal. And that's exactly what happened during the February 2021 cold outbreak that we've been talking about. It was one of those very large dips in the jet stream. And we know also that when we see these very wavy patterns in the jet stream, they tend to hang around a long time. When those waves get really big, they tend to kind of get stuck in one place. And so that's why that particular cold spell lasted so long, because that wave in the jet stream was so big and it just sat there, and all that cold air just kept draining down into the southern states and causing all kinds of havoc. So we do think there's a connection to climate change. And if we have time, I would also like to talk about how the polar vortex was involved, because it is another piece of that puzzle, but it's a little bit long to explain. And so if we have time, I can go into that as well.
Any comments, Deepti?
So I was actually thinking of that, and for the summertime, where we have heat waves, and heat waves are kind of also connected to the things that are happening with the jet stream. And I think, if I'm not wrong, feel free to correct me, Jennifer, but the link between changes in the Arctic and influences on the jet stream in the winter in the summer are actually stronger in terms of how they've affected more persistent and more frequent extremes in the mid latitudes. And so, I was thinking about this in the context of, both the power outage situation as well as the infrastructure failing during the heat waves that we've had across the U.S. Here in the Northwest, where we had the record-breaking heat wave from 2021. That one, our cables, the max cable lines melted, and people weren't able to get to places where they needed to be to access cooling shelters. And so, thinking about the vulnerability side of this, and thinking about how we can potentially manage that in terms of with this expectation of more frequent, more persistent extremes is I think really important for minimizing some of these health impacts.
So that said, would you say that people need to focus more on preparedness and building resiliency in their local communities than relying on, say, federal and state policies to solve the problem?
And I think I think there's we need both things simultaneously, right? We know that the amount of warming, we're committed to some level of additional warming than we have today. We're even if we stop emitting greenhouse gases today, there's going to be some level of additional warming, and we need to build resiliency. We need to update our infrastructure because then when these extreme events happen, we can cope with them better, and that does require building resiliency in local systems. But for disasters that happen with wildfires or with hurricanes, we do need federal assistance. We need preparedness at the national level, and so I think we need to think about both scales.
I would agree with that. Here in Massachusetts, I think our state has been particularly proactive in providing communities with resources to first identify the vulnerable infrastructure, properties, aspects of our society really in our towns. So coming up with a list of things that really need to be addressed, and then coming up with a plan to address those. And then the state provides funding to actually do that work. And so in our town, for example, we've put together a hazard mitigation plan, which includes that inventory and also how we need to say change pumping stations for sewage that brings sewage from one side of town to the treatment plant. And if it's in an area where flooding is apt to happen in a hurricane, which we're going to get another hurricane here someday, no doubt about it, then that pumping station and the piping are all vulnerable. And then if that happens, then all of that sewage is going straight into the ocean. So things like that we can identify, we can be very specific and ask for funding to rebuild some of that infrastructure. But individuals also have to play a role with their own property. They have to think about, their own infrastructure of their homes, and part of that is education, just making them aware of the kinds of storms, the kinds of extreme events, whether it's fire in the Pacific Northwest, and out west is a much more of a bigger issue than it is where I live here in southeastern Massachusetts. But we have other things that are more important in this area. So being very specific about the kinds of risks that we're facing and also the vulnerabilities that exist in our own infrastructure.
I have a more global question. For many years, we've had experts telling us what we need to do to stop global warming, and we have the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, giving us specific numerical goals on greenhouse gas emissions as a point of discussion for governments to actually set to make pledges for action. The feedback loops we're learning about, such as the atmospheric feedback loops, are those adding on to the tasks that we need to do to prevent or limit global warming over and above what the IPCC has told us?
Well, many of the feedbacks that we heard about in the film are incorporated into these very complicated computer programs that we use to simulate how the climate system works. And so the projections for the future, given our behavior, how much of those emissions of greenhouse gases are we going to be able to curtail, gives us different scenarios for how the future could unfold. And so those computer models are basically a bunch of equations that take into account all of the processes that are happening in the climate system. And many of those feedback loops, like the ones I talked about, like with water vapor, for example, are included. But there are others that are not. And that's where a lot of the research is right now. And one of those, for example, is the feedback loop that involves permafrost. Permafrost is the frozen soils up in the high latitude land areas of North America and Eurasia. And as we're warming that Arctic super fast, like I described, that permafrost, which is, you could think of it almost like hamburger. It's soil, but with a lot of organic stuff in it. And as it thaws, that organic material breaks down. And as it breaks down, it releases carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere, which of course are greenhouse gases. So that is going to compound the problem. Well, those processes in permafrost are really not incorporated into the models. And so there's this source of additional greenhouse gases, and it's been estimated that the permafrost contains about twice as much carbon as the atmosphere has in it right now that could potentially get released into the atmosphere. We need to be able to incorporate those processes into the models. So I guess the short answer to your question is yes and no. The projections are pretty accurate, but there are some feedback loops that are not incorporated yet.
Any comments, Deepti?
Yeah, so the one of the feedback loops that I think about here, particularly with the hazards we're experiencing out west, is not in the context of how much more warming will happen, but how that warming is going to affect extreme events. So when we have drought conditions and you have a heat wave occurring in areas that are affected by drought, sometimes there are feedbacks that can occur between the atmosphere and the soils that can make those heat waves hotter. And there is some evidence from research studies that have been published in the last year that indicated that the record-shattering heat wave we had last year that affected the Western US was actually exacerbated by the drought that happened, that was kind of going on here. And so those kind of feedbacks create uncertainties in terms of how, in projections of how we are going to experience the impacts of that global warming. And those are things, again, those are like active areas of research. We still have to look at our models to see if they are able to simulate these processes and potentially like build our like understanding of how those feedbacks work. And like with the example I just described, those feedbacks are not very well understood, and they're understood in certain parts of the world, but not here in the West. And here, because of the dramatic changes we've seen in the hydroclimate of the region, these are emerging risks, and so there's still some uncertainty there. And so so this is not necessarily in how it's going to make the global warming worse, but how it's going to make the things like extreme events worse.
You mentioned the role of land use and the role of the soil in releasing carbon dioxide, and also not being able to trap and hold carbon and moisture. Could either of you comment on the potential role of transitioning to regenerative agriculture? Has anyone studied how big an impact that could have, either in this country or in other countries where they're actually making that transition already, on how that might interrupt this atmospheric feedback loop?
That's actually one of the major research areas that we're focusing on at the Woodwell Climate Research Center, where I work here in Falmouth, Massachusetts. Both the regenerative or basically helping farmers use their soils more effectively so that it doesn't release as much carbon into the atmosphere. And it turns out that it's also more cost effective for them, and the crops grow better too. But I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, and that's really not in my area of research. But another overlooked area that we have a new project focused on is rangeland areas. So places where animals are grazing, and there are different practices that can be used that actually allow the soils and the vegetation there to sequester much more carbon from the air and put it down into the roots. And so there's a lot of things that are relatively simple that can be changed. And it's just a question of making that case very clear for the rangeland owners that, if they just behave differently and work their land differently, that it can make a big difference, not only to the amount of carbon that gets taken out of the atmosphere, but also to the bottom line of their business, which is usually a good motivator.
Yeah, and I think about like agriculture-based solutions in places like South Asia, which is where some of my research has focused. And there, if you're probably aware that they grow a lot of rice in Asia, and paddy production is actually a major source of methane. And so thinking about like there is some research, we know that these like paddy fields are a major source of methane, but there is like agriculture, there is research in areas to try to understand like how we can either maybe not have these kind of have such extensive paddy production in these areas, or make those practices less carbon producing, for lack of a better word. And so some of the research that we've been doing is also thinking about how we can potentially rethink agriculture in those regions, because I digress here a little bit, but the diets of people in the region have changed because of how agriculture has changed, and the crops like rice, which are now major food cereals that are grown in those regions, are both not nutritious, and they are producing a lot more greenhouse gas emissions. And so there is a push that some of the research that I've been involved in has resulted in to shift cereal production from rice to more climate resilient and less greenhouse gas emitting, greenhouse gas producing cereal crops. And the other solution that is sort of being talked about is using irrigation, and that's actually kind of not clear in some areas. We know that irrigating fields and irrigating areas can cool surfaces down. But in places like South Asia, there's been some recent work showing that that can actually make heat stress worse because of the feedback that we were talking about. When it's hotter, you have more moisture that gets the soil, the atmosphere can kind of hold more moisture, there's more evaporation. And even if it cools a little bit, the excess moisture that's present in those areas can increase heat stress. It can increase wet bulb temperatures that Jennifer was talking about. And so that is not, like, there can be some maladaptation there if we think about, relying on irrigation to like reduce heat stress to some extent.
Another aspect of this, of course, is forests, and you can think of them as, I guess, agriculture in a way. But it's another very, very important natural climate solution, because trees sequester a lot of carbon, and their trunks, their roots, their branches, their leaves all hold on to a lot of carbon. And so whenever we cut down a tree, it eventually is going to release that carbon into the atmosphere. If it's burned, as we're seeing happening to a really disturbing extent, especially in places like the Amazon forest these days, the burning there and the deforestation there has been going on a rampant pace. And even though everybody knows that we've got to protect the especially tropical rainforests, and it's sounding like, again, this is out of my realm a little bit, but there's a real potential for the Amazon forest, especially, to flip from being a carbon absorber to being a carbon emitter, as more and more land gets changed from a dense tropical rainforest to agriculture, to fields of mostly corn and soybeans. Because as they do that, they cut down the forest, they burn it, and then the soil that's left behind is really not that, it's not very fertile. They only get a couple of years of good crops out of it, so they have to put a lot of fertilizer into it, which is another source of greenhouse gases. And it, at some point, if enough of the Amazon forest is lost, it completely changes the whole hydrologic system, the water system of the region, because the forest emits a lot of water vapor in the atmosphere, which condenses into clouds and then falls as rain. And that creates a cycle within the Amazon forest itself. But as much more of that forest is being cut down, drought is becoming a much bigger issue. Fires, wildfires, which never were a problem there, are now becoming an issue. So it's changing the whole climate of that section of South America.
An interesting question in the chat. Someone asked or mentioned the last IPCC report mentioned that warming will stop as soon as we stop emitting greenhouse gases, which was a change from previous analyses, which suggested that a certain amount of warming is quote unquote baked in. Can you talk about what led to this reassessment and what you think about it in relation to the feedback loops we're talking about, like the melting permafrost?
Do you want to try that one, Deepti, or do you want me to?
Sure. I think that the IPCC reports have actually been pretty consistent in saying that the impact of emitting greenhouse gases is going to last for, even if we stop emitting, there is going to continue to be warming. So I'm not aware of them changing their statement about that. I think it's been pretty well understood that greenhouse gases stay in, like greenhouse gases like CO2 and methane tend to stay in the atmosphere for a while. CO2 tends to stay in the carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for like close to 100 years, and methane stays in the atmosphere for about a couple of decades. And we know that these are going to continue to have an effect, even if we stop emitting today, unless we're actively removing carbon from the atmosphere. And as long as greenhouse gas concentrations are high, we are expected to see them having an effect on the climate system. And the IPCC reports have been pretty consistent about that. They've been potentially, there's been like new information about how much that warming is going to be, but but not about whether it's going to stop or whether there isn't some warming baked into the system.
I think it was more of a change in the language describing what can happen if we are able to get to net zero, where net zero is the amount of greenhouse gases we're putting into the atmosphere equals the amount that's being taken out by like forests and the oceans and all of the natural processes that are there. In which, if we can achieve that, then the concentration, the amount of greenhouse gases will stabilize. If we can stabilize the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, then their heat trapping effect is going to also stabilize. So that, I think that's what they're saying, is that if we can reach this stable concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, the heat blanketing effect will not get worse. But that doesn't mean that we're not going to see sea levels continue to rise, because that is a train that's left the station. The sea levels are going to continue to rise. We're going to continue to see ice melting in the Arctic, in the Antarctic, on glaciers, and those things are going to have multiple feedback loops associated with them. One of them is related to sea level rise, of course, but also as we lose that sea ice in the Arctic, that sets up the feedback loop that is causing the Arctic to warm so much faster, which is then affecting our weather patterns. So even if we can maintain the amount of global warming, the effect of, think of it as the thickness of the blanket on the earth, if we can stabilize that, that's a good thing, but we are going to still see these changes that are already been set in motion continuing.
Thank you. And that amplifies your earlier point that we have to really take into account the non-human sources of greenhouse gases that we have let loose through warming in our predictions of where our temperature is going to stabilize and what our goals should be. There are ways to get below net zero, for example, setting up carbon sinks through agriculture and other natural processes that will trap and store carbon. Could you comment on a couple of those that people can imagine in their future?
Sorry, was
Go
the
ahead.
question about, was the question about the types of carbon sinks?
Yes,
so
that we can amplify.
The forests that Jennifer was talking about earlier, that forests are a sink for carbon, and expanding that in places where they are effective is an important way to expand our carbon sink. So that's one that I can think of immediately.
And some of the others we've already talked about, better agricultural practices, better soil management, better grazing management. All of those things have the potential to absorb more of the greenhouse gases that's in the atmosphere already, and putting them into the soils, putting them into the roots of plants. So there's a lot of different ways that nature already does this for us, and right now we're just pushing it too hard, and we're also taking away some of these mechanisms that that nature has by cutting down forests, by by growing massive crops and rice and corn with a lot of fertilizer, and overturning the soil so that all of the organic matter does decompose and releases carbon into the atmosphere. And if you don't do those things, then you can potentially sequester more carbon into the soil. And unfortunately, I have to go in about 5 minutes. I have another event that I promised to be part of, but I'm happy to maybe take one more question.
There aren't any other questions in the chat, but one thing I'm curious about is we've been talking a lot about feedback loops related to the land and the atmosphere, but the oceans, of course, are a huge area and have a big role in these feedback loops of moisture transfer. are there any promising projects going on with, say, aquaculture, growing and developing markets for seaweed, for example, or other ocean life that have the potential to trap carbon and also interrupt some of these feedback loops?
Well, I will jump in on that one, Deepti, because I'm going to leave you stranded here for a little while. It so happens that my daughter is working for a company that is doing just that. Their mission is to grow kelp. Kelp is a seaweed that's really large, and it's also very good at, when it grows very fast. It takes carbon out of that's dissolved in the ocean water and also out of the atmosphere through the ocean. And they're attempting to grow kelp at a massive scale, starting with their first project in Namibia and planning to expand into Alaska, New Zealand, and perhaps elsewhere. And they're growing it on frames in deep water, so not along the shore where kelp normally grows, but they're setting up these moored frames offshore where there's plenty of nutrients in the water for the kelp, and they do that in places where kelp grows naturally and the water's very cold, and that's why Namibia is a good place to start. It's the country just north of South Africa on the west side of Africa there. So yes, there's a lot going on. That's just one company. There's a lot of other smaller companies that are looking to kelp and kelp-like seaweeds, because it is such a good way to take dissolved carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And the other part of that equation that you mentioned, Daniel, is the funding for it. So kelp, it turns out, can be used to make a lot of things that we use every day. It can make biofuels. It can be used to create a plastic substitute. It can be used to make fibers, to make clothing. It can go into animal feed, and when animals eat it, they produce much less methane. So you get kind of a double whammy impact there. So there's a lot of promise, and I think there's a lot of interest in this kind of work too. So we'll see. Stay tuned.
Thank you. More power to your daughter and her company. Well, Deepti, anything to add on that note?
I'm actually not super familiar with efforts like that in the ocean. So I mean, other than what Jennifer mentioned. So I think those are I don't have much to add to that.
And I see there's a comment in the chat there saying that seaweed is being used as a food source for cows. And that was what I was talking about, is it can be made into food for cows, and the cows belch much less methane when they eat kelp-based food rather than what they usually eat.
At this point, Jennifer, I'm going to let you go, and with deep gratitude for your being on this panel and offering so much information and so much of your fruits of your experience. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. I'm sorry I can't stay till the end, but that's the way it goes sometimes. We'll see you soon, Deepti. Thank you for being part of this with me. And thank you, Daniel, and everyone there. It's been really great to get this information out and see more people watching these important Earth emergency films, because I think they're very, very well done. In fact, the person that our Woodwell Climate Research Center is named after, George Woodwell, said that the Earth emergency films were the best climate documentaries he'd ever seen. So if you haven't seen them, go watch them, because they really did a great job. Thanks again. Good night.
And Deepti, I've been wondering, since you live right at the edge of the Great Temperate Rainforest in Vancouver, I recently heard or read something that was supposed to be good news, where the Canadian government or somebody offered to preserve the rainforest, the temperate rainforest in Vancouver Island. But then when I read the article, they said, oh, well, we'll preserve just a third of it, and make that untouched in return for being able to log the remaining 2/3, which sounded like a deal with the devil. Decision makers in Canada actually been provided the data on what a free service the temperate rainforest is providing in stabilizing our climate, and are they taking that seriously?
So I have to make a tiny correction. I'm actually not in Vancouver, Canada. I'm actually in Vancouver, Washington. But I guess I can speak a little bit to what you were saying there. The forests here, actually, there's been like recent evidence that shows that actually these temperate forests are also really important in withdrawing some of the CO2 out of the atmosphere. Their potential for reducing for removing CO2 is actually pretty substantial and comparable to what you would have from other parts of the planet. And so it is important to conserve those. And, in addition to conserving them, just better management of forests is really important, even to reduce our risk of things like fires. There are many organizations here that are advocating for increasing our forest cover, which is hugely important from a climate perspective. It's hugely important from the perspective of managing the consequence of climate hazards, because we have more forests that can help our landscape be more resilient to extremes, and then better forest management is really important to reduce the risk of fires as well. And so there's a lot of discussion. I'm actually part of this like Cascadia hazards group, and there we talked to a lot of people that are involved in like management of different hazards, and yeah, there are efforts to kind of advocate for preserving our forests here and potentially increasing them as well.
Another feedback loop that I deal with every day as a doctor is the emotional health of my patients. And we know from many studies that the changes in our environment, particularly climate change, is having a significant impact, particularly on the mental health of young people who want to have a future that's as good as their grandparents. And activists need to maintain our mental health in order to continue to advocate for the planet and a future for everyone that's just and equitable. Do you have any suggestions for our audience on how they can be sustainable, both in terms of emotional and other wellness, as we continue these efforts to keep things going?
Yeah, I mean, you touch on some really important things there. There is a lot of climate anxiety in the younger generation, but also what I have seen in my interactions is that a lot of them are actually taking action. They realize that this is really important, and it's empowering for them to be involved in solutions and to advocate for their own future. And so that's kind of what I encourage students to do. I often talk to middle school and high school students about climate change, and I'm like honestly pleasantly surprised at just how involved they are in their in the schools, in reducing the carbon footprint of their schools, and advocating for transition towards greener energy, for supplying the energy that they use in their schools, and also advocating for better climate policy even within the district and within the state. And it's incredible. And then you've probably also heard of kids who are advocating for fossil fuel companies to take more responsibility, and they're like lawsuits that have been entirely initiated by them. And so I think being involved somehow and being I think that can be empowering for people. I think one of the harms that I see from some of the coverage of climate change in the media is that it makes it sound so doomist, and like our future is basically like fires, heat waves, hurricanes, and catastrophe, and And the article that Luke pointed to says that our future is in our hands, right? The amount of warming that happens depends on how much and how we develop as a society. And so thinking about like, just, I think for students to like, for younger generations to like realize that they do have a role and like things that we do matter, and that the world is like not going to come to an end tomorrow, even though we do see some pretty severe impacts of climate change playing out, that we do have some say in what the future looks like. And I think that can be really, really helpful. Yeah. But just to kind of add to that on the emotional and mental health side, I think one of the things we do need to think about is how climate change is affecting the health of people that are being impacted right now, right? And there are people when people are either when their like towns and homes burn down from wildfires, or when their homes get flooded and they lose everything, that is something that has major health impacts on people's like emotional and mental health. And oftentimes the people that are experiencing the most hazards are generally communities that are underserved, that have less access to resources, to healthcare resources, less access to disaster preparedness, and generally tend to experience a higher frequency of hazards. And just like repeatedly experiencing multiple hazards, again, that's something that has like these compounding effects on people's health in so many different ways, not just physical health, but also emotional and mental health.
And that's actually brings up a wonderful opportunity that we have as activists in our communities. Climate change is creating so many people migrating to other countries, fleeing the impacts of climate change, including Latin America, where many of the economic impacts that are driving the social instability and violence there are actually at one of the root causes of this migration of people from Latin America to the U.S. And when we welcome those people to our communities, it's important to keep in mind the trauma that they've been through. So we're well aware of that as healthcare providers, but also they bring also a lot of knowledge of agricultural methods and so many skills that don't depend on the technology we've developed here in the U.S. Or in the industrialized world for keeping things going, and also for organizing and maintaining spiritual and emotional health. So that's a resource that I think we should not overlook. Do you have any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we are certainly, facing the kind of consequences of climate change that are basically forcing people to be displaced. And I think, as citizens, we do have a role in like thinking about how our communities are going to respond to that, to migration, both within the country and or from other countries. Yeah, I mean, I'm not, I don't have any thoughts about like how that can be done, but that's, advocating for people, advocating for refugees, and for the country to have a better plan for supporting climate refugees who are basically driven out of their homes, and mainly because of climate change that's attributed to things that people in the global north have contributed to.
Now, Tanya has raised her hand. She has a question.
Hi, Deepti, I'm actually still stuck on something that you said earlier. It sounds like you're saying that there's almost mini feedback loops that are caused by dramatic changes in climate and weather, and you gave one or two examples of that. And I'm wondering, is this something that needs to be kind of thought about in a localized way, or because these patterns are continuously happening, it's more of a global issue now?
Well, feedbacks play out on many different spatial scales. So there are local feedbacks like the drought and heat connection I was talking about, where if you have hotter conditions. They dry out soils, and those drier soils, they absorb less of the heat. And so more of the heat actually heats up the atmosphere and the soil rather than being used to evaporate moisture. So we have kind of more severe heat waves and when there are drier conditions. So that kind of feedback is something that happens locally, but we also have this feedback that we were talking about earlier because of the changes that are happening in the Arctic that affect other regions. They're affecting regions outside the Arctic. They're affecting us here in North America. They're affecting extreme weather in Europe and in Asia. And so I think these are, so we know some of them to a pretty good extent, and those are covered in the feedback loop videos. And then there are some that we don't know about, which are potentially going to make some of these impacts worse than we had understood or we understand right now. So there's some, those can happen on local scales, they can happen on global scales, they could exacerbate the effect of warming on global scales, but also exacerbate things like heat waves that are happening more regionally. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you. It really does. I should probably also just make note of the fact that it's 7 o'clock. And I appreciate your being here, Deepti, and finishing things up for us on your own since Jennifer had to leave. I thank you also, Dan, for being here as our moderator. I thank everyone else who participated in this panel tonight. Please be reminded that our next Climate Emergency Film Club is October 20th at 6 p.m.